All right, this is a newspaper that was sent to me by Parmenio Iglesias. He writes in the column, please read pages 8 and 9, read carefully. This is required reading for every person of goodwill in the entire world. Parmenio A. Iglesias, U.S. government is a massive criminal enterprise. It's from the First Freedom, December of 2014. P.O. Box 385, Silver Hill, Alabama 36576. Nothing neo about the neocons. Nothing neo about the cons. By Lieutenant Colonel Donald Sullivan, retired. His email address is ALOE910 at AOL.com. ALO910 at AOL.com. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will be victorious in 1,000 battles, was Sun Tzu's advice to us several thousand years ago in his classic military guidebook, The Art of War. I have this quote on the wall of our classroom where my grandchildren are sometimes homeschooled. Unfortunately, the lines between friend and foe have been muddled in this country since the early 1800s. The situation is even more unclear today, thanks to our compromised media and government. A case in point, the U.S. government will literally stop at nothing. The U.S. government will literally stop at nothing when promoting its agenda of worldwide imperialism, which agenda has put us all in danger. There are countless examples of its duplicity, but recently one came to the fore when a veteran/victim of Operation Northwoods wrote me about his experiences. Parmenio Iglesias was a Cuban national who legally immigrated to the United States in 1955. By 1956, he had enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and become an American citizen in 1960. Following his several years of exemplary service, United States government agents approached him in 1959 for a clandestine action against Cuba, but he ignored them. Then in 1962, other agents tried to enlist him again for an operation against Cuba, to participate together with other Cubans to wear a Castro's Army uniform, be taken to Guantanamo U.S. Naval Base in Cuba, murder a few American sailors, put the blame on Castro's army, and then the U.S. had a good excuse to invade Cuba, starting a war. I refused to participate to murder U.S. sailors, quoting from his letter to me. Following his refusal to commit treason, according to his letter and the documents included therein, Airman Iglesias became investigated on charges of spying for Cuba against the United States, interrogated and tortured for 4 days, nearly killed by the OSI in October of 1962, during which time the government spread rumors in his unit and to his friends, family, and acquaintances that he had deserted the Air Force and returned to Cuba. He was confined for 2 months within the base hospital at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio, and treated for injuries sustained during his detention. Discredited by Air Force psychiatrists and hurriedly discharged in early 1963, he still suffers from those abuses today at 77 years of age. Northwoods. Mr. Iglesias has been seeking redress for his grievances against the United States since 1963. There have been 8 years of litigation along the way, with thousands of pages of documents provided to him under the court order when the Air Force refused to release them voluntarily. His investigation continues to this day, but any of us familiar with the workings of our judicial system understands the futility of such a venture. There are a few success stories, but more often than not, we wind up wasting our lives chasing windmills while bureaucrats and lawyers laugh behind our backs at such crazy conspiracy theories, not realizing that one day the evidence of their unwitting conspiracy will come back to haunt them, and there's no one left to save them. Technically speaking, and according to currently released documentation, none of the operations under Northwoods became active, yet the truth may never be known. Mr. Iglesias certainly has suffered under the plan in a real sense, and the attempt to cover up the intentions of the government in Operations Northwoods was very much active. The plan, which called for the CIA or other operatives to commit acts of terrorism in U.S. cities and elsewhere implicating Castro, was rejected by President Kennedy as soon as he got wind of it. The operation had originated within the Joint Chiefs, was signed by Chairman Lemnitzer, a Zionist Jew, and sent to the Secretary of Defense. It proposed creating public support for a war against Cuba by blaming that country for terrorist acts. At the time of the proposal, Cuba had recently undergone a revolution in which U.S.-backed Fidel Castro assumed power. When Castro then rejected the U.S. and favored Russian communism, the U.S. became determined to get rid of him and his new government. As part of the U.S. government's anti-communist Cuban project, Operation Northwoods, proposals recommended hijackings and bombings followed by the introduction of phony evidence that would implicate the Cuban government. Desired from the execution of this plan, it would give the United States the appearance of having suffered indefensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba, and develop an international image of a Cuba threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere. Deceit. Several other proposals were included within Operation Northwoods, including real or simulated actions against various U.S. military civilian targets, including U.S. military and civilian targets, including dressing friendly Cubans in Cuban military uniforms and pretend to be saboteurs inside the base. At Guantanamo, see The Body of Secrets by James Bamford. The operation recommended developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami area, other Florida cities, and even in Washington. There was a proposal to use the death of John Glenn, our first astronaut, should his rocket explode after launch in February 1962, as a pretext to launch a war against Cuba. Fortunately, the launch and the mission were a resounding success. John Glenn returned to Earth safely. Another idea included creating an incident where a Cuban aircraft would be alleged to have shot down a civil airliner from the United States en route to a Central or South American destination. The passengers of said chartered plane might be college students on a holiday or a grouping of individuals sharing a common interest, which would cause a non-scheduled flight in or near the Cuban airspace. Paul Nietzsche, a Zionist Jew, then an Assistant Secretary of Defense, suggested sending in low-level recon planes, inviting Castro to shoot one down, thus provoking a war. Somehow to this day, the U.S. has been unable or unwilling to illegally invade Cuba under any pretense, notwithstanding the failed attempt to do so in 1963 at the Bay of Pigs, which was doomed by President Kennedy's discovery of the plot by the CIA and his refusal to provide air support. In order to rationalize and justify displeasure with the Castro regime, the U.S. embargo against trade and most travel with Cuba still stands. War on non-terrorists. Who is the enemy? Who is endangering me and my family? I think the answer is very clear. Parmenio Iglesias knows, and based upon my conversations with him and documents he has provided, it is apparent that he had spent the last 50 years trying to get justice and clear his name. He has learned, as have I, that the only justice for violations of our rights by government actors may rest in the SCOTUS opinion in the U.S. versus Lee 1892. There remains to him but the alternative of resistance, which may amount to a crime. Operation Northwoods is only one of many government false flag or illusory deceptions proposed, implemented by the United States for the purpose of dragging us into unnecessary, illegal, and imperialistic wars, which were none of our business. Some, but not all, of the other examples of the United States government duplicity, which did in fact cost many thousands of American lives, as well as the lives of other participating and non-participating countries, along with billions of dollars from our treasury, are listed below. The United States having invaded Canada in 1812 is most probably the incident which precipitated the War of 1812. With Great Britain, a war all about expansion of U.S. territory, and no matter that Americans were told that the primary cause was impressment of Americans as sailors for service in the British fleet. The area of British Canada temporarily targeted to be conquered by the U.S. was north of Detroit and included Toronto. That area was returned to Great Britain in 1814 after the war ended. The war to accelerate all wars. In the War of Northern Aggression, just another unconstitutional conflict of U.S. imperialism was kicked off by the Yankee invasion in Charleston Harbor. At a time, Sherman's pillage and rape across Georgia, JUSA. At a time, a part of the independent state of the South Carolina, yet we were taught that those South Carolinians were of the guilty party. In 1898, the 1898 explosion of the battleship USS Maine, which killed 266 crewmen in the Havana harbor, sparked the Spanish-American War, another war for territorial expansion. The explosion was never explained. The JCS suggested a similar plan as part of Operation Northwoods. As a result of that war, the United States created an unconstitutional doctrine for the government of conquered territories and possessions, including Cuba, the Philippines, and lesser others, all legalized by the Supreme Court between 1901 and 1905, as they would become termed the insular cases. These insular cases gave the U.S. a green light to legally assume the status of an imperial power. U.S. President Wilson's unauthorized invasion of Mexico in 1914 was in direct support of his favorite in that country's internal power struggle when he responded to a rounding up by Mexican soldiers of a group of sailors from the USS Dolphin on a routine fuel stop. The Mexican soldiers were loyal to the then head of the government of Mexico, Victoriano Huerta, a leader whom Wilson and company feared would be supportive of Germany in the coming European war, which was also none of our business. So Wilson's advisors bade him support the opposition led by Emiliano Zapata. Even after the Mexican government had freed those sailors and issued an apology, President Wilson still sent U.S. troops in, led by General Blackjack and Pershing, to occupy Veracruz and help install Zapata as head of the Mexican government. Those U.S. troops stayed on Mexico for almost 2 years, tracking rebel leaders such as Pancho Villa, not to protect the United States, but Mexican puppet government. Reminiscent of today's War Department, drone bombing, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and company, Pershing never caught Pancho Villa. Austrian Archduke Ferdinand and his wife were killed by a Jewish assassin in 1914 in Sarajevo, which event has been credited with being the spark igniting the Great War in Europe, a war which was, again, none of our business. In May 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, a British merchant ship carrying American passengers, 128 of whom were casualties. Clearly warned to stay out. The United States had continued to send Americans on British ships into contested waters between England and Germany after the war was declared in Europe and Britain had blockaded German ports. Then German pointed out the dangers of such foolishness through countless advertisements in American papers detailing the peril of going there. But when Wilson administration wanted the U.S. to enter the war on the side of Great Britain, France, and Russia at all cost, never mind the fact that Wilson had run on a platform promising to keep us out of that European conflict, Wilson's handlers sanctioned arming merchant ships like the Lusitania and shipping supplies aboard them, including munitions to the Brits, and the Germans knew it. Also, his U.S. Zionist Jews had brokered a deal with Britain's war cabinet in October of 1916 to bring the U.S. into the war on the side of Britain in exchange for the latter supporting the creation of Israel in Palestine as a Jewish homeland, a secret agreement which became known as the Balfour Declaration. Wilson officially cut diplomatic ties with Germany in February of 1917, claiming the unrestricted use of submarines against merchant ships as his sixth reason. Soon after, the Congress allowed Wilson to suck them into the declared war on Germany and its allies, to make the world safe for democracy, disregarding the fact that the two administration's partners in the war were monarchies and one was led. Okay, that's the all of page 8. I'm going to take a pause here at the bottom of page 8. Picking up with page 9. One was led by socialists. Franklin D. Roosevelt was just another politician who promised to keep us out of Europe's second total war. But like Wilson, he also lied. Roosevelt desperately wanted the U.S. to enter that war on the side of the Allies, again Britain, France, and Russia, and yet Americans overwhelmingly cared for no part of it. So his administration and the Department of the Navy devised a plan to goad Japan into making the first strike to change American opinion. 10 days after Japan, Germany, and Italy had agreed in September 1940 to become allies in that war against the rest of Europe, Navy Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCallum drafted a memo to his bosses outlining an 8-point plan to provoke Japan in the Pacific, inflaming another world war. When Roosevelt became aware of a possible Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he began to implement portions of that plan, two parts which were to set up a blockade of Japanese shipping lanes in the Pacific, denying them war material itself, an act of war, and to adopt a vacant sea policy clearing the North Pacific of Allied merchant ships. The Pacific Fleet was then called back to port, and the trap was set. Roosevelt issued a warning to Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the fleet in Hawaii, of a possible Japanese attack, even though he knew it was imminent, but emphasized the U.S. policy calls for Japan to commit the first overt act. He even arranged for the Japanese to listen in on a message in a code that he knew the Japanese had cracked, which hinted that we were going to sneak attack them. On December 7, 1941, 2,403 Americans died in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor during the Japanese attack, and the American people found themselves involved in yet another war where they had no business. Business as usual. The United States was involved in the affairs of Vietnam even when it was a French colony. We funded the French during the Vietnam's War for Independence. When the French vacated, we put advisors in South Vietnam and saw to it that Diem became its president. Kennedy, inheriting Vietnam from Eisenhower in 1961, wanted to reduce our involvement in that country. Finally, in 1963, he made the statement that he wished us completely out of Vietnam by the end of that year, which probably got him killed in November. In August 1964, the North Vietnamese were alleged to have attacked our American destroyer USS Maddox from numerous sea and air platforms near the Gulf of Tonkin. The following day, the U.S. forces staged a counterattack, as ordered by President Johnson, an airstrike on a fuel storage facility in Vinh, North Vietnam, destroying the facility and hitting 33 of 35 ships at a cost of 2 aircraft, 1 pilot dead, and 1 captured. On 7th of August, Congress, with near unanimity, approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which President Johnson signed into law 3 days later. As requested by Johnson, the resolution authorized the chief executive to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. No approval of oversight of military force was required by Congress, essentially eliminating the systems of checks and balances that is so fundamental to the U.S. Constitution. Thus, the United States entered a 10-year war with North Vietnam, which resulted in over 55,000 American dead and countless thousands of Vietnamese killed, though the attack by North Vietnam never happened, and the security of the United States was never under any threat whatsoever from Southeast Asia. War was never declared on North Vietnam. A Mideast war trap is baited. On August 2, 1990, Premier Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait with the objective of re-annexing that sovereign country and its oil fields to Iraq. Prior to his invasion of Kuwait, Hussein had gotten permission in writing from the United States for its foray into Kuwait, assuring him that U.S. would have no interest in his invasion of Kuwait as long as no U.S. interests were threatened. His request and the response from the United States are part of history, if not widely known. Iraq annexed Kuwait 6 days after the initial invasion, but not before U.S. suddenly expressed its disapproval of King Hussein's actions and initiated Operation Desert Shield to force Iraq out of Kuwait. Just the beginning. Between January and April of 1991, a coalition force from 39 countries attacked and forced Iraq to relinquish Kuwait in Operation Desert Storm. I was asked to participate, but declined a pending declaration of war by the Congress. After weeks of air attacks on Iraq's major cities, ground forces were deployed for 4 days, beginning February 24, 1991, with Kuwait being liberated on February 27th. More than 100,000 Iraqi troops were killed, plus countless thousands of innocent civilians. The U.S. lost 383 dead. War against Iraq was never declared by the United States, and American interests were never threatened in any way. So the United States used this needless invasion of the Middle East as a springboard for its endlessly illegal and unconstitutional forays there and elsewhere ever since. Following September 11, 2001, on which day the 3 towers of the World Trade Center in New York were expertly dropped into their bases, U.S. President Bush II, without any evidence that Osama bin Laden had either orchestrated the attack or was even in Afghanistan, demanded that the Taliban, the country's then legitimate government, hand over bin Laden and expel al-Qaeda. The Taliban asked bin Laden to leave the country but declined to extradite him without convincing evidence of his involvement in the 9/11 attacks. In the United States, this is called probable cause. The United States refused to negotiate, and President George W. Bush launched an invasion of Afghanistan on the 7th of October 2001, with no declaration of war. The U.S. and its allies took over there, drove the Taliban from power, and set up military bases near all major cities across the land. Few al-Qaeda and Taliban troops were captured, escaping to neighboring Pakistan or retreating to rural, remote, mountainous regions. The invasion of Afghanistan had been planned long before those 3 towers came down and was merely awaiting an excuse. The war in Afghanistan to this day being the longest-running war in our history, and yet Afghanistan has never been a threat to the United States or any of its possessions. Thus, the true reason for the Afghan war is still not addressed, but one can be assured it had nothing to do with the World Trade Center bombings. Anyone who questions that official explanation is labeled as anti-American. The missing evidence. After the U.S. invasion and defeat of Iraqi forces in the above-mentioned Kuwait conflict, the United States engaged in a protracted effort to goad Iraq into violating the restrictions placed upon that country by the United Nations following the end of those hostilities. For several years, the United States and the United Kingdom had maintained the Iraq's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction or weapons of mass destruction posed a threat to their security and that of their allies. Yet the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission found no evidence of WMDs. When Ron Paul made a motion that the House International Affairs Committee amend its proposed resolution to authorize the President to use military force against Iraq, calling for a declaration of war on Iraq as required by the Constitution, the chairman of the committee, Representative Henry Hyde, said, "The Constitution has been overwhelmed by events and by time. It's not relevant." As I recall, the resolution passed with only one dissenting vote, that of Dr. Paul. The killing goes on. On March 19th, the day I filed my federal complaint against the President and Congress to prevent/stop invasion due to no declaration of war, the United States began its surprise military invasion of Iraq. This led to an occupation and eventually the capture of Saddam, who was later tried in an Iraqi court of law and executed by a gang of thugs the U.S. claimed was the new Iraqi government. Investigations by the U.S.-led Iraq Survey Group following the invasion found that Iraq had ended its nuclear, chemical, and biological programs in 1991, was conducting no such active programs at the time of the Bush regime's invasion, and no active chemical, biological, or chemical programs have been discovered since. George J. Tenet, former director of the CIA, held that Vice President Cheney and other Bush administration officials had pushed the country to war in Iraq without conducting a serious debate regarding whether Saddam Hussein had posed an imminent threat to the United States. And then we have Korea, Iran, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, South Africa, Panama, Grenada, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Honduras, Colombia, Venezuela, Somalia, Lebanon, Russia, and many, many more. No war is declared by the United States these days. One setup follows another endlessly. The description and names of America's current enemy changing constantly. There can be no peace until the United States learns or gets taught to mind its own business. Again, I ask, who is the enemy? Who is endangering me and my family?